They fired her for cultural attire. Then the court ordered a $2.5 million settlement. The colorful fabric of Amara Patel's dupatta caught the morning light as she walked through the glass doors of Morrison and Associates for what she thought would be just another Tuesday at the prestigious marketing firm. The silk scarf, embroidered with delicate golden threads that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family, rested gently around her shoulders like a whispered prayer from her grandmother. What Amara couldn't have known was that this piece of her heritage, this tangible connection to her roots, would soon become the center of a legal battle that would expose the ugly underbelly of corporate discrimination and ultimately change how American workplaces think about cultural expression. The 26-year-old marketing coordinator had no idea that her supervisor, Janet Morrison, had been watching her from across the open office space, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. What Amara also couldn't have predicted was that by the end of the day, she'd be cleaning out her desk, fighting back tears as security escorted her to the parking garage. And she certainly never imagined that 18 months later, she'd be sitting in a federal courthouse listening to a judge order her former employer to pay her $2.5 million in damages for what would become one of the most significant workplace discrimination cases in recent memory. This is the story of how a young woman's refusal to abandon her cultural identity sparked a legal revolution that would protect countless others from facing the same impossible choice between their heritage and their career. Amara had been dreaming of working at Morrison and Associates since her senior year at Northwestern University. The Chicago-based firm represented some of the biggest brands in the Midwest, and their innovative campaigns had caught the attention of marketing students across the country. When she landed an interview during her final semester, she felt like she was finally getting her shot at the career she'd been working toward since childhood. Her parents, Raj and Priya Patel, had immigrated to the United States from Gujarat, India, when Amara was just 3 years old. They'd arrived with 2 suitcases, a handful of distant relatives' phone numbers, and an unwavering belief that America was a place where hard work and determination could create opportunities for their daughter that they'd never had. Raj found work as a software engineer, while Priya took a job at a local elementary school, first as a teacher's aide and eventually earning her teaching credential through night classes. The Patel family had always been intentional about maintaining their cultural connections while embracing their American life. Sunday dinners featured both Indian classical music and Chicago Cubs games on the television. Amara grew up speaking Hindi with her grandparents during their annual visits, while perfecting her English accent by watching American sitcoms with her friends from school. She celebrated Diwali with the same enthusiasm she brought to 4th of July barbecues, understanding instinctively that her identity didn't have to be an either-or proposition. When Amara started at Morrison and Associates in September, she felt like she'd found her professional home. The office was modern and diverse, with employees from various ethnic backgrounds working collaboratively on campaigns that reached audiences across cultural lines. Her immediate supervisor, David Chun, was a second-generation Chinese-American who appreciated Amara's unique perspective on reaching multicultural markets. Her colleagues seemed genuinely interested in her background, asking thoughtful questions about Indian festivals and traditions during lunch conversations. For the first 3 months, Amara thrived. She contributed to successful campaigns for a local restaurant chain looking to expand into predominantly South Asian neighborhoods, and her insights helped the firm secure a major contract with a beauty brand targeting diverse millennials. Her performance reviews were stellar, and David had even mentioned the possibility of a promotion to senior coordinator by the following summer. Amara's wardrobe reflected her bicultural identity in subtle but meaningful ways. Most days, she wore typical business attire, tailored pants, blouses, and blazers that wouldn't look out of place in any corporate environment. But she also incorporated elements of her heritage: a delicate gold bracelet that had belonged to her great-grandmother, small hoop earrings inspired by traditional Indian jewelry, and occasionally, a dupatta worn as a scarf or wrap that added color and texture to her professional outfits. The dupatta held special significance for Amara. In Indian culture, it's more than just a piece of fabric. It's a symbol of grace, modesty, and cultural pride. Her grandmother had given her the particular dupatta she wore most often. explaining that it had been worn by women in their family for generations during important occasions. When Amara wore it to work, she felt connected to her ancestry while still maintaining her professional appearance. None of her colleagues had ever commented negatively on her cultural accessories. In fact, many of them complimented her style, noting how she managed to look both professional and distinctive. David had once mentioned that her ability to bridge cultural aesthetics was part of what made her so effective at reaching diverse audiences in their marketing campaigns. The first sign of trouble came in late December, when Janet Morrison, the firm's co-founder and David's superior, returned from a month-long sabbatical. Janet was a woman in her early 60s who had built the company from the ground up during an era when few women held leadership positions in marketing. She prided herself on running a professional operation and had strong opinions about workplace appearance and behavior. During Janet's first week back, Amara noticed that the older woman seemed to watch her more closely than other employees. When Amara walked past Janet's glass office, she could feel eyes following her movements. During team meetings, Janet's gaze would linger on Amara's attire, particularly when she wore her dupatta or other cultural accessories. The confrontation came on a Wednesday morning in January. Amara had arrived at work wearing a navy blazer, matching pants, and her grandmother's dupatta draped elegantly around her shoulders. She was reviewing campaign materials at her desk when Janet approached, her expression stern and unforgiving. "Miss Patel," Janet said, her voice loud enough that nearby colleagues turned to look. "I need to speak with you about your appearance." Amara looked up, confused. She'd dressed professionally, following the same guidelines she'd been adhering to for months. "Is there a problem with my outfit, Mrs. Morrison?" "That scarf," Janet said, gesturing dismissively at the dupatta, "is not appropriate for our workplace. This is a professional environment, and we can't have employees wearing ethnic costumes to the office." The words hit Amara like a physical blow. Ethnic costume. The dupatta that connected her to generations of strong women in her family had just been reduced to a costume by someone who clearly didn't understand its significance. Around the office, conversations stopped as colleagues strained to hear what was happening. "Mrs. Morrison," Amara said, trying to keep her voice steady, "this is a dupatta. It's a traditional Indian scarf, and it's part of my cultural attire. I've been wearing it to work for months without any issues." Janet's expression hardened. "I don't care what you call it. It's distracting and unprofessional. I'm implementing a new dress code that prohibits ethnic clothing. You'll need to remove it immediately and leave it at home from now on." The unfairness of the situation was overwhelming. Amara looked around the office, noting that several of her colleagues wore items that reflected their own cultural backgrounds. A co-worker's Celtic knot pendant, another's yarmulke, a third's cross necklace. Why was her cultural expression being singled out as problematic? "Mrs. Morrison, I understand the need for professional dress, but this dupatta is no different from any other scarf or accessory. It doesn't interfere with my work performance, and it's part of my cultural identity." "Miss Patel," Janet said, her voice rising, "I won't have this office looking like a United Nations meeting. Either you follow our dress code, or you'll need to find employment elsewhere." The ultimatum was clear, but Amara couldn't bring herself to abandon such an important part of her identity. The dupatta wasn't just clothing. It was a connection to her grandmother, to her heritage, to the women who had worn it before her during their own moments of significance. Removing it felt like erasing part of herself. "I can't do that, Mrs. Morrison. This is part of who I am." Janet's face flushed with anger. "Then you've made your choice. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The next hour passed in a blur of humiliation and disbelief. Amara packed her personal belongings into a cardboard box while her colleagues watched in shocked silence. David tried to intervene, arguing that Amara was one of their best employees and that her cultural attire had never been problematic before. But Janet's decision was final. As security walked Amara to her car, she felt the weight of generations of discrimination pressing down on her shoulders. Her parents had faced similar prejudice when they'd first arrived in America, but they'd taught her that things were getting better, that her generation would have more opportunities and face fewer barriers. Standing in the parking garage, holding a box of her belongings, Amara realized that progress wasn't as linear as she'd been taught to believe. That evening, Amara sat at her parents' dining table. The dupatta spread across the wooden surface like evidence in a crime scene. Her mother held her hand while her father paced the living room, his engineering mind trying to process the illogical nature of what had happened to his daughter. "Beta," her mother said softly, using the Hindi term of endearment, "you cannot let them win. This is not just about you. It's about every person who has ever been told that their culture is unwelcome in America." Her father stopped pacing and looked at his daughter with the same determination that had carried him across oceans to build a new life. "We will fight this, Amara. We didn't come to this country so that our daughter could be forced to hide who she is." The decision to pursue legal action wasn't made lightly. Amara knew that fighting a well-established firm would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. There was also the risk that other employers might view her as a troublemaker, making it harder to find new work. But the alternative, accepting that her cultural identity was somehow less worthy of respect than anyone else's, felt like a betrayal of everything her family had sacrificed to build their American dream. Through a referral from a family friend, Amara found herself in the office of Maria Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney who specialized in employment discrimination cases. Maria had built her practice on representing employees who'd been marginalized or mistreated because of their identity, and she immediately understood the broader implications of Amara's case. "This isn't just about your right to wear a dupatta," Maria explained during their first meeting. "This is about the fundamental principle that cultural expression is protected under federal civil rights law. Your employer created a hostile work environment based on your national origin and ethnicity." The legal process was more complex than Amara had anticipated. Maria and her team had to prove that Janet Morrison's actions constituted discrimination based on national origin, that the company's sudden dress code change was pretextual, and that Amara had suffered damages as a result of the discrimination. They gathered evidence from Amara's colleagues, documented her exemplary work performance, and researched similar cases across the country. What they discovered was both encouraging and disturbing. Federal law clearly prohibited employment discrimination based on national origin, and courts had consistently ruled that employers couldn't ban cultural attire unless it genuinely interfered with job performance or workplace safety. However, many employees who faced similar discrimination never pursued legal action due to fear, cost, or lack of awareness about their rights. The case attracted attention from civil rights organizations across the country. The Council on American Islamic Relations offered their support, noting similarities between Amara's experience and discrimination faced by Muslim women who wore hijabs. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People highlighted the case as an example of how workplace discrimination had evolved but not disappeared. South Asian advocacy groups rallied around Amara, viewing her case as a test of whether American workplaces would truly embrace diversity or merely tolerate it. As the legal process unfolded, Amara faced the practical challenges of unemployment. Despite her strong qualifications and positive references from David and other colleagues, she found that potential employers seemed hesitant to hire someone involved in a high-profile discrimination case. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being discriminated against for fighting discrimination. During this difficult period, Amara found unexpected support from former colleagues at Morrison and Associates. Several employees reached out privately to share their own experiences with Janet Morrison's problematic behavior. A Jewish employee revealed that he'd been asked to remove his yarmulke during client meetings. A Latino colleague shared that he'd been told his accent was unprofessional and needed to be toned down. An African-American woman described being criticized for wearing her hair in natural styles that were deemed too ethnic. These testimonies painted a picture of a workplace where diversity was tolerated only when it could be contained within narrow, Eurocentric boundaries. Janet Morrison, it seemed, had been enforcing an unwritten policy that cultural expression was acceptable only when it was invisible or easily ignored. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed even more damaging evidence. Email exchanges between Janet Morrison and other executives showed a pattern of discriminatory language and decision-making. In one particularly damning message, Janet had written to a client, "We're trying to maintain a certain image here, and some of our employees don't understand that their ethnic accessories can be distracting in professional settings. Another email revealed that Janet had specifically instructed HR to avoid hiring candidates who might bring too much of their cultural background into the workplace. The company's own records showed that minority employees were significantly more likely to receive negative performance reviews and less likely to be promoted, despite having qualifications and work quality comparable to their white colleagues. As the case proceeded toward trial, Morrison and Associates found themselves under increasing public scrutiny. Social media campaigns supporting Amara gained traction, with people sharing photos of themselves wearing cultural attire to work with hashtags like #CulturalPrideAtWork and #DepatDiscrimination. The company's reputation suffered as potential clients and employees questioned whether they wanted to associate with an organization that had been accused of systemic discrimination. The trial itself was both grueling and empowering for Amara. Taking the stand to describe her experience required her to relive the humiliation and pain of being told that her cultural identity was unwelcome. But it also gave her the opportunity to speak truth to power, to explain why the DePata meant so much to her and why Janet Morrison's actions had been so devastating. When Mrs. Morrison called my DePata an ethnic costume, Amara testified, her voice clear and strong, she wasn't just criticizing my clothing. She was telling me that my heritage, my grandmother's legacy, and my cultural identity were somehow less valuable than conforming to her narrow definition of professionalism. The defense team's arguments were predictable but legally weak. They claimed that Morrison and Associates had the right to establish dress codes and that Amara's termination was based on her refusal to follow company policy, not her ethnicity. However, they couldn't explain why the dress code had been implemented suddenly and applied selectively, or why Amara's cultural attire had been deemed problematic while other employees' cultural expressions were ignored. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of cultural suppression in the workplace and the legal precedents establishing employers' obligations to accommodate cultural expression. The testimony painted a clear picture of discrimination that violated both federal law and basic principles of human dignity. The turning point came when David Chun, Amara's former supervisor, took the stand. His testimony revealed the extent to which Janet Morrison had overridden his authority and ignored his positive evaluations of Amara's work. Amara was one of our most talented employees, he testified. Her cultural perspective was an asset to our team, and her attire was always professional and appropriate. The decision to terminate her was based on prejudice, not performance. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a verdict in Amara's favor. The $2.5 million settlement was one of the largest workplace discrimination awards in the state's history, reflecting both the severity of the discrimination and the impact it had on Amara's career and emotional well-being. Judge Patricia Williams, who presided over the case, used her closing remarks to address the broader implications of the verdict. This case reminds us that true equality in the workplace requires more than simply avoiding overt discrimination. It demands that we create environments where all employees can bring their authentic selves to work, where cultural diversity is not just tolerated but celebrated. The settlement money was transformative for Amara, but the real victory was the precedent the case established. Morrison and Associates was required to implement comprehensive diversity training, revise their dress code policies, and create oversight mechanisms to prevent future discrimination. The case became a template for similar lawsuits across the country, empowering other employees to challenge discriminatory practices they had previously accepted as unchangeable. 6 months after the trial, Amara launched her own marketing consultancy, specializing in helping companies develop authentic multicultural campaigns. Her first major client was a Fortune 500 company that wanted to improve their workplace diversity initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now being paid to help other companies avoid the mistakes that Morrison and Associates had made. The DePata that had caused so much controversy became a symbol of resistance and pride. Amara wore it to every major business meeting, every speaking engagement, and every interview where she shared her story. It served as a reminder that cultural identity should never be sacrificed for professional acceptance. 3 years later, Amara stood before a group of young professionals at a diversity conference, wearing her grandmother's dupatta with pride. Behind her, a PowerPoint slide displayed the words "cultural authenticity in the workplace." And in the audience, she could see attendees from dozens of different backgrounds, many wearing their own cultural accessories without fear or shame. "My grandmother gave me this dupatta when I graduated from college," Amara told the audience. "She said it would remind me to always be proud of who I am, no matter where life takes me. I never imagined that it would become the center of a legal battle, but I'm grateful that it did. Because sometimes, the most important fights are the ones we never planned to have." The case had ripple effects far beyond the courtroom. Corporate America began to take notice of cultural discrimination in ways they hadn't before. Major companies revised their dress codes, implemented cultural sensitivity training, and created employee resource groups focused on celebrating diversity rather than suppressing it. For Amara, the victory was deeply personal, but also universal. She had proven that cultural identity doesn't have to be checked at the office door, that professional success doesn't require cultural assimilation, and that standing up for your principles, even when it's costly and difficult, can create change that benefits everyone. The dupatta still hangs in her office, not as a piece of clothing, but as a reminder of the power of refusing to be invisible. It represents the courage to be authentic in a world that often demands conformity, and the belief that America's strength lies not in its uniformity, but in its diversity. Every time a young professional wears a hijab to work without fear, every time someone speaks their native language during a lunch break without shame, every time cultural attire is celebrated rather than criticized in an office setting, Amara's fight continues to matter. The $2.5 million settlement was just the beginning. The real victory was changing hearts, minds, and policies in ways that will protect future generations from ever having to choose between their heritage and their career. The little girl who had learned to navigate between two cultures had grown into a woman who refused to let others force her to choose just one. And in that refusal, she had created space for countless others to be fully, authentically themselves in the American workplace.